Not doing that anymore. Oh, there's ash everywhere.
It began as a holiday. Eager to escape a bright future on the Great Plains, Arthur Howitzer Jr. transformed the series of travelogue columns into the French Dispatch.
Bonjour, my friends, and welcome to my wistful, scantily furnished French loft. Today we are talking about The French Dispatch, the latest film by writer-director Wes Anderson and his first to be released through the Walt Disney Corporation. It tells the story of the final issue of The French Dispatch of the Liberty, Kansas Evening Sun, which is basically the New Yorker magazine with the baked-in essence of Hemingway and Midwest ennui turned up to 11. It features pretty much every actor ever in several distinct vignettes. And it is wonderful. With each new Anderson film, it seems like we have the same conversation. Isn't he just repeating himself? His particular sense of careful storybook staging, deadpan dialogue, and adolescent intellectual angst was all very well and good in the 90s and early aughts, but aren't we beyond that now? My answer, if it isn't clear by me talking about this new film here and now, is obviously no. Those who come to the conclusion that all of Anderson's films are the same, while certainly allowed their opinion, do not read these films very deeply. The Grand Budapest Hotel may still be his masterpiece, but The French Dispatch is nonetheless a delightful work of the highest quality, melding pre-New Wave French style with that certain je ne sais quoi Anderson-ness to create a rambling but not directionless, highly flavorful confection. Go see it.
We take as the subject of tonight's lecture Mr. Moses Rosenthaler, certainly the loudest artistic voice of his rowdy generation.
Simone Naked Cell Block J Hobby Room. I want to buy it.
This is a beautiful movie to look at, and I mean that in just about every sense one can mean it. Its photography, for starters, both in color and quite often the black and white we all secretly hoped Anderson would reach for someday, is a treat. The color sequences tend to use a far less saturated palette than in Anderson's other live-action movies. Gone are the reds and violets of Budapest, the marigolds and greens of Moonrise Kingdom, replaced with cold blues and grays. In other words, a perfect match to this movie's setting and tone. This all would have been perfectly satisfactory on its own. However, the movie's black and white sections truly steal a show. I find they evaporate the whimsy and storybookness these movies can sometimes have and which some people don't care for, replacing them with a kind of classic formalism that gets to the bones of the scenes and lays everything bare, much more like Fellini or Carol Reed than anything Anderson's ever done. There is, of course, also the frame, which, as always, is packed with detail, too much for any single viewing and a reason in itself to return again. Within the frame are the sets and costumes, which are no less delightful than always. I struggle to find why we sometimes fault Wes Anderson for being so specific in the visual elements of his films, when so many movies today just can't be bothered to make even clear compositions, much less one so perpetually striking and evocative as he gets to.
The kids did this. Obliterated 1,000 years of Republican authority in less than a fortnight. What do they want? Freedom. Full stop.
I'm naked, Mrs. Clemens.
Its external beauty notwithstanding, the film's true core is in its script. All of Anderson's work, but particularly his collaborations with Roman Coppola and Hugo Guinness, have a love of language that is sorely lacking in contemporary cinema. This being the story of a literary magazine, it is only appropriate that this movie have some of Anderson's best writing to date. Its narrated sections, of which there are many, never overstay their welcome because they are just so delightful to listen to. And honestly, who couldn't listen to Jeffrey Wright the whole day long? I'd listen to him narrate himself doing his laundry. The writing also achieves a careful balance between the tone of the film overall and the many avenues and detours of the various stories. When so many films struggle to find equilibrium with far less going on, this is another element that should be praised here.
Lieutenant Nescaffier. He is the great exemplar of the mode of cuisine known as police cooking.
Of course, all this is more or less par for the course for Anderson. For any of its new elements, this movie is not really a radical departure for him, to the delight or chagrin of his respective fans and detractors. We know his movies are carefully constructed at both the written and visual levels, and apart from the black and white, the film's novelty lies mostly in its structure, it being comprised of distinct vignettes representing the several stories printed in the magazine. Now, if you are something of a stickler for story structure, as I often am, this might give you pause. And I suppose it's a to each their own type of thing, but I think that this gimmick works in this particular instance. And I'll also say that is a world in which Wes Anderson gets to make stories that are like TV episodes like a bad thing? This is, I think, where he shows his development as a filmmaker. Even though the film is made of distinct, non-overlapping stories, it has a consistent tone and, more importantly, theme throughout.
Just try to make it sound like you wrote it that way on purpose.
To some extent, all these different stories are all about the marvelous absurdity of creation, ultimately working smoothly together to prove the movie's thesis. And that thesis is that writing, and by extension writers, are as indispensable to knowing the world as they are useless to understanding anything in it, and that's fine.
Oh, shut up.
It is a paradox that, if you write, I think you must know at some level. You know that the world can be broken down into subjects, and those subjects into stories, those stories into component parts, and those parts into words. The only way we really have of giving meaning to anything is through stories. Minus our stories, all we have is untethered information. But at the same time, if you write, you know that writing, like all things, must pass, and any understanding it creates or happens upon is fleeting. It is absurd in the truest Camusian sense, the frantic, obsessive search for meaning where there is none, and fiercely loving the process anyway. In a way, this is a familiar theme for Anderson. Much of his work deals in the realization that most things, good and bad, don't tend to matter for very long because they are eventually replaced, but we should nonetheless seek to enjoy them anyway. I suppose the pleasure of allowing him to treat with this theme time and again is that melancholic joy his particular amalgamation of staging and language produces. There is not an Anderson movie which doesn't at times make me intensely sad, nor is there one that doesn't have frequent moments of pure, irreverent glee. Often these moments intersect uncomfortably, but also beautifully. That Anderson has mastered this particular sensation isn't something that ought to be held against him, and the fact that he revisits variations on similar themes means he takes them seriously enough to keep thinking about them even after the movie is done. What else would we want from a serious artist? So we have here an exquisitely beautiful movie with some of the best cinematography of Robert Yeoman's career, a movie which delights in and explores language, and one which interrogates why we make things in the first place, particularly written things. There are many stories about writers, but this is the first in a long time that offers any insight. It gets at that loneliness which a writer feels for his subject once it is written and therefore known, and therefore, once again, alien and apart from him.
You don't think it's almost too seedy this time?
No, I don't.
For decent people.
It's supposed to be charming.
So, yeah, I go see this movie. It's got stuff to say, and it looks great, and it's funny, and kind of sad, and kind of hopeful. And like the best French pastry, even its indulgences are meaningful, or at least not without a certain pleasure.
1 hour to press.
You're fired.
Really?
Don't cry in my office.
You might think that this pop cigarette is too far for movie critique, but you'd be wrong.